Welcome to Tech Brothers. In this video, we're going to learn how to install SQL Server 2016 in cluster mode. But before we start our installation, let's take a look what exactly do we need for our installation to be successful. First thing we need is Windows cluster that should be already created, and all the nodes that's going to take part in this installation needs to be part of that cluster. Since we're going to install SQL Server in cluster mode, we need shared storage. That means that storage needs to be presented to all the node that's going to take part in this installation. Number three, since SQL Server is going to be installed, so all the prerequisites on all the nodes of SQL Server installation needs to be completed before we can start our SQL Server installation. Number four, SQL Server virtual cluster name. This needs to be unique, and static IP address. This will be needed during our installation, so make sure that you get a static IP that is available from your network team. And once the installation is completed, we'll be testing our failover. So let's talk about the storage. In my case, since this is a demo, but I split my storage this way. These are the disks that I'm going to present to the cluster where I'm going to install SQL Server 2016. So system databases 5 gig. I have very small disks again, just because it's demo. User data, user log, tempdb is 10 gig. In SQL Server 2014 and 2016, you have a choice to create multiple tempdb files during your installation. So I'm going to create around 5 files to make sure that your initial size and your disk space is optimal for creating that many files. So in my case, it's 10 gig, so I might be creating 5 files, tempdb files during my installation. Number 5, you have a quorum 1 gig. Either you can just present a disk and use that disk as a quorum. You also have a choice to create a file share as your quorum, but that file share needs to be accessible from all the nodes that's taken part in this installation or that's part of this cluster. MSDTC is optional. I'm using disk and I'm creating the role. I have already created in this cluster that I'm going to show you in a second, MSDTC, but it's optional. You don't have to create it. If cluster doesn't have MSDTC role, it'll use the local node DTC services for your distributable transactions. So let me show you my current setup, and we'll quickly go through my setup, and then we will add our storage and start installing SQL Server 2016. All right, this is my setup. This is my cluster 2016.techbrothers.local. That's my cluster name that's already created. Let's expand that. Click on roles. As I mentioned that I have 2016 MSDTC role already created. That's why it's showing right now right here, but you have a choice not to create it and let SQL Server take advantage of local DTC. But I like to maybe stay conventional and create the MSDTC role. Click on nodes. In my case, there are 2 nodes. This is 2 node cluster, and configuration is going to be active passive. SQL prod 1 is going to be my primary node, and SQL prod 2 is going to be my secondary node. So what it means is that I'm going to start my installation from SQL prod 1, and then I'll be adding SQL prod 2 as a node, as a secondary node. Let me click on storage and click on disk. There is only 1 disk at this moment. We'll be adding rest of the disk in a moment, but cluster disk 5, in my case, I'm using disk as a MSDTC role. This disk is being used for MSDTC in this demo. Click on networks. I always like to use 2 networks. One is cluster and client. This is the communication between your main network and your cluster, and then other one is private communication, also known as heartbeat. So this communication will take place between your cluster nodes only. If you notice that the cluster and client subnet in my case is 1, and if I click on cluster network 1, that is private communication, you'll see my subnet changes right here. You can't use the same subnet and in my case it's 2. So you can create the cluster without private communication, but I can assure you, in my experience, if you don't have a heartbeat, your cluster might be unstable. You can create it, you can install it, but it might fail over more frequent than you expect. So let's add the storage. Before we add the storage in our cluster, let me quickly say this, that when your storage is presented to your nodes, in my case I have 2 nodes, so shared storage is basically presented to all the nodes. So you have to decide which node you're going to make primary. In my case, I decided SQL Prod 1 is going to be my primary node, so I will remote into SQL Prod 1 and bring the disks online on only my primary server. So I'll scan the disk and I'll bring the disk online and initialize it and format it, and I'll show you in a second that what are the disks available on my primary. Make sure that you do that only on your primary and don't bring the disk online on your secondary servers, because secondary nodes, because later on it creates some issues with the volumes and all that. In order to avoid the confusion, just bring the disks online and format and everything on your primary node, and then add to your cluster. Don't add to your cluster first and then try to change your drive letters or volumes. If you have a mount point, try to add that before you give it to cluster, because once the cluster takes over, hold on to your disk, there are very limited functions that you could do with the disk because it's already owned by your cluster. So make sure that whatever the functions such as creating volume or giving drive letters, bringing it online and formatting it, all those functions needs to be done prior to you give it to the cluster, prior to you add that particular disk or disks into your storage. So let me show you my storage real quick. So if you click on disk management, you will see that I am in my primary. SQL Prod 1 is my primary node. So these are the disks that's already been online. You can right click and bring it online and then initialize it, as you can see right here. And I have not gone on my secondary nodes and done anything on the disk. So that's what I would recommend, that just remote into primary and bring your disk online and format it. As you can see that I have not formatted these disks. The volume letters are not assigned, which I'm going to do in a second. Only disk that was actually online and all the drive letter and all the function that you wanted to do prior to you give it to cluster, I have done that right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this now. So this is my 5 gig file. This is, I know that this is for my system file, so I'm going to click here and click on new simple volume. Next, in my case, there isn't going to be a mount point, so I will be giving drive letters to my disk because they are not many. I would recommend to use mount point if there are so many disks and multiple SQL Server instances you're going to install on that particular node. So usually mount point is a recommended way to do it, even if you're installing SQL Server, just one SQL Server instance. So let's go ahead and click next. In my case, this is going to be system databases. So I will select S. This is your choice to assign the drive letters. If you have a mount point, you can click up here. You have to bring your mount point first online and give that mount point drive letter, and then you can browse to that particular mount point and add your this disk. In my case, I don't have a mount point, so I'm just gonna select the drive letter and click next. NTFS is my recommended file system, so I will just name the SysDBS This is the volume label, and I selected format, Proforma quick format. Click next and finish. All right, as you can see that all the disks are properly formatted and properly labeled. Now they're ready to be added in our cluster. So let's go back in our cluster, right click on the disk and click add disk. It'll show you all the available storage. So in my case, there are 5 disks still needs to be added. So I'll select all of them and click OK. Click on disks. Alright, as you can see, all the disks are online and they are ready to be assigned. So when we install SQL Server, we will add those disks to the system databases, user databases, TempDB, and all that kind of good stuff. But I wanted to mention one thing, that sometimes when you add the disks, it is online. The owner node in my case is SQL Prod 1, which is my primary, and this is where I'm going to install SQL Server. But in certain cases, if the disk goes to another owner, you can use the cmd command to bring available storage to that node where you're going to install that particular row. In my case, I'm going to install SQL Server on my primary. All the disks that I'm going to use for that particular instance needs to be on this node. So in my case, right now, they are all on the node, that desired node. But in case if it goes to other node, you need to bring that back to this node where you're going to install your SQL Server instance. So now we're ready to install our SQL Server. If I go to my computer, and this is my SQL Server media, I'm going to open this media and run the setup. Right click on the setup, run as administrator. The landing page is right here. Click on installation. And since we're going to install SQL Server in cluster mode, we need to click on new SQL Server failover cluster installation. I am using this cluster for availability group as well. So if you see some of the warnings during my demo that it is already reserved and availability group cannot be created and all that, don't worry about that. I'm aware of this. If you have a cluster that is dedicated to SQL Server failover clustering, then you won't see all those errors. Not errors, I mean warnings. I'm sorry. Click next. Feature selection page. I'm going to install SQL Server Engine Services, and as you can see that SQL Server replication and all that is selected already. Data quality services right here. If you wanted to add Polybase query services for external data, you can select it, but again, if you click on this, you would need a prerequisite that needs to be installed. If I select this, Oracle SE Java Runtime Environment, you have to go to Oracle site and download that. I'm not going to install it in this demo, so I'm going to uncheck this. And installation directory is fine. All we need to do is change our root directory for our system databases. Click next. SQL Server network name. This is the virtual cluster name that I was talking about. This is the name that you'll use to connect to your named instance in cluster mode. So in my case, I'm gonna call it 2016 sales prod. Let me think about the well-qualified name. Sales production, and the named instance, this instance is going to hold mostly my production data that is related to sales. So I'm gonna just do it sales prod and click next. Click next. So these are our available disk right here. So I'm gonna click on this 2, 3, 4, and 5. We need all of them. Click. If you have more disk that's not related to this instance, don't select that, please. Click next. What this will do is basically assign these disks to that the role, the 2016 SQL Server role that we are creating right now, and it'll back behind the scene, it'll just in our cluster, it'll assign it to that installation or that SQL Server instance. Click on IPv4 and provide the IP address that you just got from your network team. Click next. And it's asking you to provide service accounts for SQL Server Agent and SQL Server Engine. I would recommend that to use separate service accounts for Agent and Engine. In my case, I do have that. Do not use default, especially in your cluster installation. You do need to know the password for that. I'm using the same account, by the way, for Agent and Engine. SQL Server browsing services, these are automatic. If you have multiple SQL Server instances running, you should have it enabled, but if your company requirement is that you should disable the SQL Server browsing services, you can disable it here, or you can disable it later. Click next. Alright, we want to install in mixed mode. So I'll provide the SA password. Make sure that you remember this password in case you need to get into SQL Server later. I'll add the current user, and also I'll add the DBA team. Oh, we'll work on that later, but I added the current one, and I'll add the cluster admin as well. These users, whoever you will add right now, will become system admin in your SQL Server. Click data directory. This is our system data root. In my case, it's S. As you remember, this is okay for me. I'm going to change that user data directory because I have a separate disk for that. So in my case, it's E. I'll just change this drive letter. Rest I wanted to keep. If you wanted to create a folder, a separate folder, you can, but I'll keep it this way and call it just the data. This folder will be created by the installation, by the way. You don't have to create it now. Backup directory, if you have a separate backup drive, you can provide it here. I'm going to back this up in my data directory. Not a recommended way to do it, but I just have a little more space in user data. TempDB. So initial size is 8 MB. Number of files, I'm going to change it to 5. Multiple TempDB files does help performance. And I'm going to remove this because I have a separate disk for TempDB. Click OK. Auto growth is 64 MB. And TempDB log file is going to be in the same drive. If you're storing images or dealing with files, you should enable your file stream. In my case, it's going to be mostly transactional, so I will not enable my file stream on this particular SQL Server instance. I'm going to click Next. This is the summary, what it's going to install. So I'm going to click on Install and I'll pause the video. It's going to take some time. Once the installation is completed, I'll be back. If I run into any issue, I'll let you know the issue and also the resolution.